Step aside. These tickets are flagged. You two don't belong in Celeste class." The words didn't slip out quietly. They were declared like policy, loud enough for the entire Terminal 4 check-in area to hear. Karen Whitmore, senior gate agent at JFK's Airline counter, stood behind her computer screen, with her arms crossed and suspicion written all over her face. She wasn't asking questions. She wasn't seeking clarification. She had already decided that the two black teenagers in front of her, dressed in jeans and blazers holding first-class boarding passes, were frauds. What Karen didn't know was that in exactly 28 hours, the father these girls were about to call would shut down her entire airline. Every plane, every route, worldwide. She didn't know that the calm, poised 17-year-old staring back at her was the daughter of Desmond Williams, CEO of Williams Aviation Capital, the company that owned 81 of Airline's 92 aircraft. She didn't know that her smugness, her casual cruelty, her petty exercise of power would trigger a corporate earthquake that would cost her employer nearly $1 billion and strip her of the only kingdom she'd ever ruled. All Karen knew was that she held the power in this moment. The power to approve or deny. The power to let someone pass or force them to step aside. The power to decide who belonged and who didn't. And she was about to learn that power, when abused, always finds its way back to you. Before we get into how a single phone call grounded an airline empire and destroyed the careers of everyone involved, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever been judged before you even opened your mouth, hit that subscribe button. Because this story isn't just about two girls and a gate agent. It's about what happens when people mistake their position for permission to dehumanize others. Now, let's go back to how this moment started. Imani and Zuri Williams wheeled their matching carry-ons toward the Airline Celeste class lane. Around them, Terminal 4 at JFK buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Friday afternoon, before Memorial Day weekend rolling luggage clattering over tile overhead announcements, echoing through vast spaces, the sharp scent of overpriced coffee mixing with jet fuel and anticipation. Imani, wearing a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white tee and dark jeans, adjusted the strap of her leather bag. Her natural hair was pulled up into a high, elegant puff that framed her face. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every achievement on her resume. Debate captain. 4.0 GPA. Provisional patent holder on a water filtration device she and her sister had designed for communities without clean water access. Beside her, Zuri moved with the easy grace of an artist. She wore a flowing linen jumpsuit in soft cream, her locks cascading past her shoulders and adorned with wooden beads that clicked softly as she walked. Where Imani was precision and logic, Zuri was intuition and creativity. Together, they were a force. They were students at Dalton Academy, one of Manhattan's most elite prep schools, and they were headed to the Bahamas for a week-long marine conservation program. It wasn't a vacation. It was a prestigious scholarship opportunity they'd competed against 300 applicants to win. Their bags were packed with research materials, diving equipment, and the kind of excitement that comes from doing something you've worked years to achieve. Excited Zuri asked, adjusting one of the beads in her hair. For the seminar, or for a week away from calculus, Imani grinned. Both. They joined the short line at the priority counter, standing on the plush red carpet reserved for Celeste class passengers. Ahead of them, a middle-aged white businessman in an expensive suit was being processed with smooth efficiency. Behind them, a young couple, Marcus Chen, 28, wearing a tech startup hoodie, and his wife waited patiently. The gate agent's name tag read Karen Whitmore. She was in her mid-40s with a severe platinum blonde bob that looked like it had been cut with a ruler. Her navy Airline uniform was pressed to razor-sharp creases. She processed the businessman's documents without looking up. her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced, almost robotic precision. When he walked away, Karen lifted her eyes. They swept past Imani and Zuri, entirely landing on Marcus and his wife behind them. Next, she called, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. Imani stepped forward, placing both passports on the counter with a polite smile. "Hi, we're checking in for Flight 825 to Nassau." Karen's pale blue eyes flickered from the passports to the girls, then back to the passports. She picked up Imani's passport with 2 fingers, holding it delicately as if it might contaminate her. Her thumb rubbed over the photo page, slowly, deliberately, like she was testing whether the ink would smudge. "Williams," she murmured, her tone holding a note that wasn't quite accusation but wasn't welcoming either. She set the passport down and began tapping at her keyboard. The silence stretched. Each keystroke seemed intentionally slow. The couple behind them shifted their weight. Someone in the regular economy line coughed. The overhead speaker announced a gate change for a flight to Atlanta. Karen stared at her screen, her expression unreadable. Zuri glanced at her sister. Imani's smile hadn't wavered, but her eyes had sharpened slightly. They'd been here before, not literally, but in spirit. They knew the feeling of being looked at and found wanting before a single word had been exchanged. "And you're both in 2A and 2B?" Karen finally asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and didn't believe it. "Yes, that's right." Zuri added her own smile, bright and unwavering. Karen's fingers continued their slow journey across the keyboard. Click. Pause. Click. Pause. She tilted her head slightly, squinting at the screen like she was deciphering ancient hieroglyphics. Behind the twins, Marcus Chen pulled out his phone ostensibly to check his email, but his thumb hovered over the camera app. Something about this interaction felt wrong. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize the microaggressions, the coded language of gatekeeping. "I'm seeing an issue with these tickets," Karen finally said, still not looking at the girls, her gaze fixed on her monitor. Imani's smile dimmed just slightly, an issue Karen's mouth pressed into a thin line. "The system is flagging the payment source." Imani's brow furrowed in confusion. "My father booked them directly through our corporate account last month. We have the confirmation email." Karen didn't look up from her screen. Her fingers drummed once on the edge of her keyboard, a small gesture of impatience. "The system is flagging the payment source. It seems irregular for this type of seating class." The implication hung in the air like smoke. 2 black teenagers, first-class tickets. The computer infallible objective neutral says something's wrong. The subtext was clear as glass. This doesn't add up. Zuri's hand tightened around the handle of her carry-on. This wasn't the first time they'd encountered this particular brand of suspicion. It had happened at boutique stores in Soho where security followed them through aisles. It had happened at restaurants where hostesses double-checked their reservation 3 times. It had happened in 100 small ways throughout their lives. The raised eyebrow, the extra verification, the assumption of fraud before innocence. But it had never been this overt. This public. "I can assure you, our father's corporate account is perfectly fine," Imani said, her voice remaining steady, though a knot of frustration was beginning to tighten in her stomach. "Could you please just try running it again? Perhaps it was a system glitch." Karen's pale eyes lifted from the screen for the first time, meeting Imani's directly. "Our system doesn't glitch." She pushed both passports back across the counter with her fingertips as if the documents themselves were suspect. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. I can't check you in. You'll need to go to the main customer service desk at the end of the terminal to sort out your payment." The main customer service desk. Imani knew what that meant. A snake pit of frustrated passengers with complex ticketing problems, staffed by overworked agents who couldn't care less about anyone's tight connections. It would take hours to get through that line. Their flight boarded in 45 minutes. But we'll miss our flight, Zuri said, disbelief creeping into her voice. There must be something you can do. Can't you call someone to verify it? Karen? Whitmore offered a thin smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed the small dominions of power they'd been given. The smile of someone who knew they held all the cards and were relishing the moment. Our policy is clear, she said, her voice taking on a rehearsed bureaucratic quality. I can't issue boarding passes for flagged tickets. Now please step aside. You're holding up my Celeste-class passengers. My Celeste-class passengers. The words landed like a slap. The message was unmistakable. You are not one of them. You don't belong here. This red carpet, this priority service, this basic dignity, it's not for you. The humiliation was a hot flush that crept up their necks. Around them, people were watching now. The businessman who'd just been processed glanced back with mild curiosity. An elderly white woman in pearls stared openly, her expression a mixture of pity and judgment. Marcus Chen's wife whispered something to him, her face tight with second-hand embarrassment. The twins had been raised to excel, to achieve, to walk into any room with their heads high because they'd earned the right to be there. Imani had won the state debate championship 2 years running. Zuri's art had been featured in a Manhattan gallery. They were scholarship students, patent holders, honor roll fixtures. And yet here they stood on the cold linoleum outside the velvet rope, being treated like criminals in a gilded cage of their own making. Imani took a slow breath, marshaling every ounce of composure she'd learned in debate tournaments. She was the pragmatist, the one who believed in logic and process. She would try one more time. Ma'am, she began, her tone meticulously polite. I understand you have procedures to follow, but we have our tickets, our passports, and our confirmation. Everything is in order. Is there a supervisor we could speak with? Karen's expression hardened. Behind her eyes, something cold and defensive flickered to life. She'd been challenged, and she didn't like it. You think my supervisor is going to tell you something different? Her voice rose slightly, just enough for others in line to hear clearly. You think you can just demand to see a manager because you don't like the rules? We're not demanding anything, Zuri interjected, stepping up beside her sister. Her voice trembled slightly, anger and injustice making her hands shake. We're asking you to help us solve a problem that your airline created. We are ticketed first-class passengers, and you're denying us boarding without a valid reason. The words first class seemed to trigger something deeper in Karen. A sneer ghosted across her lips there and gone in an instant, but both twins caught it. Everyone thinks they're a VIP these days, Karen said, her voice dripping with disdain. The tickets you hold are worth more than the car I drive. It's a red flag, girls. A big one. It's my job to spot them. It's called diligence. There it was, laid completely bare. They weren't passengers with a ticketing issue. They were red flags. Young black in seats they couldn't possibly have come by honestly. The prejudice was so thick in the air it was suffocating. Imani felt her sister's hand find hers, squeezing once. A silent communication. We're not crazy. This is happening. This is real. I'd like to speak to your supervisor, Imani said. Again, her voice dropping to a register of absolute calm that anyone who knew her would recognize as barely contained fury. Now, please. Karen exhaled a long, exasperated sigh. She pressed a button on her headset and spoke into it, her tone suggesting she was calling for backup to deal with difficult children. David, I need you at position 3. Customer issue. Then she turned back to her screen, dismissing them entirely as if they'd already ceased to exist. The wait for the supervisor felt like an eternity. Around them, the terminal continued its chaotic dance, oblivious to the small, quiet violence happening at gate position 3. David Price arrived 3 minutes later, though it felt like 30. He was a man in his early 50s with thinning brown hair and a tie that had been loosened sometime around noon. His eyes darted around constantly as if he were perpetually looking for the next fire to put out. Everything about his demeanor screamed. Middle management caught between corporate directives from above and operational chaos below, master of neither. Karen spoke to him in a low, conspiratorial tone, her hand cupped near her mouth, though she made no real effort to be quiet. The twins couldn't hear every word, but they caught enough. Suspicious tickets, demanding teenagers, refusal to accept proper procedure. The narrative was being woven in real time, and they were powerless to stop it. David approached them with an expression of weary resignation, like a man who'd already decided how this conversation would end before it began. "Ladies, I'm David Price, shift supervisor," he said, his voice carrying the false brightness of customer service training. "Karen tells me there's an issue with your tickets." Imani explained the situation for the third time, her voice steady, despite the rage building in her chest. She showed him the confirmation email on her phone, pointing out the confirmation number, the ticket numbers, the payment method clearly listed as Williams Aviation Capital, Corporate American Express. David looked at the phone screen for exactly 2 seconds before handing it back. "I understand," he said, though his tone suggested he understood nothing and cared even less. "But I have to trust the system. And Karen is one of our most experienced agents. If she says there's a flag, there's a flag. Our hands are tied." "So what are you saying?" Zuri demanded, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. "That we're just supposed to miss our flight? Miss a program we've worked years to get into because your computer has a flag and no one is willing to make a single phone call to verify it?" David glanced around nervously. A small crowd had gathered now, not openly staring, but hovering near enough to watch the drama unfold. The worst thing in the world for someone like David Price was a scene. Complaints could be handled, angry emails could be forwarded, but a public confrontation with witnesses with phones potentially recording that was dangerous. "You're causing a scene," he said quietly, stepping closer and lowering his voice. "The best I can do is offer you a rebooking fee waiver if you can sort this out with customer service, but you need to lower your voices and step away from the counter." That was the final straw. They were being humiliated, discriminated against, and now they were being told to be quiet about it. They were being policed not for any wrongdoing, but for their reaction to the wrongdoing being done to them. Imani's voice went dangerously quiet, the practiced calm of the debate captain coming to the forefront. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You are denying us access to a service we paid for based on nothing but your agent's baseless suspicions. You're publicly accusing us of fraud, and your primary concern is that we are making a scene." Around them, the world had shrunk to the space of this confrontation. Marcus Chen had his phone out now, angled discreetly but deliberately toward the counter. A woman in a business suit stood frozen mid-step, her own boarding pass clutched in her hand, watching with an expression of dawning horror. A teenager in a college sweatshirt had stopped scrolling through his phone and was paying attention, his eyes wide. Some people looked away, embarrassed to witness what was happening. Others whispered to their companions, but everyone knew. Everyone could see exactly what this was. David shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. To back down would be to admit that Karen had made a mistake, to admit that the system had failed, to admit that he, as a supervisor, had failed to supervise. "I'm doing what I can within the constraints of our policy," he said, the words coming out rehearsed hollow. "Your policy is the problem," Zuri shot back. Karen, watching her supervisor defend her, felt emboldened. She stepped out from behind the counter, her posture straightening with renewed authority. "David, they're becoming disruptive," she said, her voice loud enough to ensure everyone nearby could hear. "Maybe we should call security." The word hung in the air like a threat. Security. For two 17-year-old girls in blazers and jumpsuits holding valid passports and legitimate tickets asking to board a flight they had every right to be on. Zuri's eyes filled with hot, angry tears that she absolutely refused to let fall. She looked at her sister, and in that glance an entire conversation happened. We tried. We were polite. We were patient. We did everything right, and it doesn't matter. Imani saw the defeat creeping into her sister's expression and felt something inside her harden into steel. She thought about their father, about the lessons he'd taught them, about the world he'd tried to build for them where their merit mattered more than their melanin. She thought about every time he'd told them, "You belong anywhere you choose to be. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." And she made a decision. "You know what Imani said?" Her voice clear and ringing in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their section of the terminal. "You're right. We should make a call." She pulled out her iPhone, but she didn't search for Orifly customer service. She didn't look for the general complaints line. She scrolled through her contacts past friends and classmates and teachers until she found the one that mattered. Dad. As she pressed the call button, she looked Karen Whitmore directly in the eye. The gate agent's expression was smug dismissive, certain of her power in this moment. "You said you had to trust your system," Imani said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "Let's see who your boss trusts more." Karen scoffed, her arms crossing over her chest. "Go ahead. Call your daddy. See what good it does you." But there was something in Imani's eyes that should have warned her. A certainty, a knowledge, a calm that came from somewhere deeper than teenage bravado. The call connected after 2 rings. "Dad," Imani said, and for the first time her voice cracked slightly, the emotion finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "We have a problem. 340 miles away, in a glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of a building overlooking Bryant Park in Manhattan, Desmond Williams put his merger meeting on hold. He was in the middle of negotiating a $400 million aircraft purchase agreement with a consortium of European investors. Spreadsheets covered the conference table. His legal team sat ready with contracts. The video call with London was paused mid-sentence. None of it mattered the moment he heard his daughter's voice crack. Desmond Williams was a man who moved through the world with quiet, unshakable authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. At 48, he'd built Williams Aviation Capital from a single leased Cessna into one of the 3 largest aircraft leasing firms in the world. Airlines didn't own their planes, they leased them. And Williams Aviation Capital was the landlord for hundreds of aircraft across 6 continents. He was methodical, precise. He saw the interconnected architecture of business and capital in ways that most people couldn't fathom. He'd been underestimated his entire life for his age, for his background, for his race, and he'd turned that underestimation into a weapon. Let them think he was less. Let them dismiss him. And then let them watch as he bought the building they were standing in. But none of that mattered when he heard fear in his daughter's voice. "What happened?" he asked, his tone shifting instantly from boardroom authority to paternal concern. Imani told him everything. Karen's suspicion, the flagged system, David's refusal to help, the threat to call security. Her voice stayed mostly steady, but Desmond could hear the tremor underneath the humiliation, the anger, the confusion of doing everything right and still being treated like criminals. He listened without interrupting, his knuckles going white as he gripped his phone. His expression shifted from concern to something colder, harder, more focused. His legal team watched him with growing unease. They'd seen Desmond negotiate. They'd seen him close deals. They'd never seen this. When Imani finished, there was a beat of silence. "Put the supervisor on the phone," Desmond said. His voice was unnervingly calm, a low-pitched rumble that promised a storm. Back at Terminal 4, Imani held the phone out to David Price. "My father would like to speak to you." David sighed, an expression of profound irritation crossing his face. This was the last thing he needed. an entitled parent calling to complain because their spoiled children didn't get their way. He'd dealt with 1,000 of these calls. They all ended the same way. He'd listen politely, apologize for the inconvenience, offer a travel voucher, and move on with his day. "I am not going to speak to your father," he said, his tone condescending. "This is between you and the airline. If he has concerns, he can call our customer service line." "He insists," Imani said, her gaze unwavering. Karen laughed, actually laughed out loud, a sharp bark of amusement that drew stares from across the terminal. "Oh, for goodness sake, David, don't. They're just trying to intimidate you. Who's their dad?" "The president." There was a dangerous glint in Imani's eye now, something that should have served as a warning to anyone paying attention. "Take the call," she said, and it was no longer a request. David exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. Fine. He'd take the call. He'd listen to some angry father rant for 30 seconds, and then he'd explain airline policy in his most patient, condescending voice, and that would be the end of it. He took the phone from Imani's hand, holding it to his ear with an air of barely concealed contempt. "This is David Price, shift supervisor with Airline," he said, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone used to dealing with difficult customers. "Who am I speaking with?" He listened. The smug look on his face began to waver. It dissolved slowly like ice melting in the sun, replaced first by confusion, then by something that looked almost like recognition, and finally by dawning horror. His face went pale, then blotchy red. The hand holding the phone began to tremble visibly. "Mr. Williams, Desmond Williams of Williams Aviation Capital." His voice had gone up an octave, all pretense of authority evaporating. I don't understand. "Sir, He listened again, and now he was nodding frantically, his eyes darting from Imani to Zuri and back again with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "Yes, sir." "I see." "No, sir." "Absolutely, sir." "Right now, sir. Immediately." He thrust the phone back toward Imani as if it were radioactive, nearly dropping it in his haste to get it out of his hand. His face had gone from red to a sickly gray-green. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "What is it?" Karen asked, her smile faltering for the first time. "David, what did he say?" David turned to her, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short gasps. "Let them through," he hissed, his voice barely audible. "Print their boarding passes. First-class lounge access. Everything. Now. But the flag in the system. To hell with the flag." David's voice cracked into a shriek that drew stares from across the entire terminal. "Do you have any idea who that was? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before Karen could respond, before anyone could process what was happening, Imani's phone rang again. Her father. She answered and with deliberate slowness pressed the speaker button. Desmond Williams's voice filled the space around the counter, calm, measured, and utterly merciless. "This message is for Supervisor Price and Agent Whitmore." The voice that came through the phone's speaker was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Conversations around them began to die down. People leaned in, sensing something significant was happening. "My name is Desmond Williams. The corporate account you flagged belongs to Williams Aviation Capital. A few frequent flyers in the Celeste-class line business travelers who lived in airports, who read the financial press, who knew the infrastructure of the industry they depended on, visibly flinched at the name. It was like hearing the name Rockefeller spoken at a bank or Carnegie at a steel mill. Marcus Chen's eyes went wide. He knew exactly who Desmond Williams was. Everyone in tech knew. The man was a legend. Desmond's voice continued crisp and clear as a legal notice being read into record. "Airline currently operates a fleet of 92 aircraft. Williams Aviation Capital is the lessor for 81 of them. That includes your entire fleet of Airbus A321neo aircraft that service your most profitable transatlantic routes. It includes the Boeing 787s that fly your Asia-Pacific network, and it includes the Boeing 737 that is supposed to be Flight 825 to Nassau. Karen Whitmore's jaw went slack. The blood drained from her face so quickly she swayed slightly on her feet, leaving her skin a pasty, unwell color. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, darted from the phone to David to the twins and back to the phone. She understood now. She finally terribly understood. She hadn't been questioning a customer. She hadn't been protecting the airline from fraud. She'd been interrogating the daughter of the man who owned the very ground, or rather, the air that her entire company stood on. In our leasing agreements, Desmond continued his voice devoid of any emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying. There are service-level agreements and brand integrity covenants. These covenants stipulate that our assets cannot be associated with activities that bring our brand or the brands of our partners into disrepute. This includes, but is not limited to, discriminatory practices by airline staff. David Price looked like he was going to be physically sick. His hand clutched at his tie, loosening it further as if he couldn't breathe. He knew where this was going. He could see the train coming down the tracks and knew with absolute certainty that he was tied to the rails. As of 2 minutes ago, I spoke with my legal team. I have also left a voicemail for your CEO, Lawrence Hampton, informing him that Aurafly is in material breach of this covenant. A silence fell over the surrounding area that was almost religious in its depth. Even the ambient noise of the terminal, the rolling luggage, the gate announcements, the crying babies seemed to fade into white noise. I am invoking the right to ground leased assets, pending immediate investigation and resolution. This means, Supervisor Price, that every single Williams leased aircraft in Aurafly's global fleet is to be grounded upon arrival at its destination. No Aurafly plane leased from Williams Aviation Capital is to take off from any airport worldwide. Effective immediately. The silence was profound, absolute. The only sound was the distant tinny announcement of a flight to San Francisco now boarding at gate B42. Everyone within earshot stood frozen. The businessman who'd been processed before the twins stood motionless, his carry-on abandoned beside him, his mouth slightly open. The elderly woman in pearls had pressed her hand to her chest. Marcus Chen had stopped recording and was just staring, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. Desmond's voice came through the speaker one final time, and now there was an edge to it, the raw, barely controlled anger of a father whose children had been threatened. My daughters will be on their flight to Nassau. I expect a personal escort to the gate and an apology from you both. But make no mistake, this is no longer about a flight. You wanted to check a red flag, you just flagged the end of your airline's operational capacity as you know it. The line went dead. Imani switched off her phone and slipped it back into her pocket. She looked at Karen Whitmore, then at David Price. Their faces were masks of pure, unadulterated panic eyes, wide skin, pale mouths, working soundlessly as they tried to process what had just happened. Zuri, standing beside her sister, let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were trembling, adrenaline flooding her system, but she forced them to still. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had been completely annihilated. The gatekeeper had been dethroned. The plug hadn't just been pulled, it had been ripped from the wall, taking half the infrastructure with it. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to confirm what everyone had just heard, David Price's radio crackled to life. Static hissed, and then a frantic voice cut through high-pitched with barely controlled panic. All stations! All stations! This is Operations Control. We have a Code Red situation. I repeat, Code Red. All Aurafly departures are on indefinite ground. Stop effective immediately. All departures worldwide. Acknowledge immediately. David fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely press the transmit button. His voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Terminal 4. Supervisor acknowledges. What's the nature of the code red? The voice crackled back, frayed at the edges with stress and confusion. We don't know. The order came from the top. Executive suite. Something about a breach of contract with a lessor. All call signs with WAC designation in the registration are grounded immediately. There was a pause, and then the voice came back quieter now, almost disbelieving. David, that's almost the whole fleet. David Price stood frozen, radio in hand, as the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on him. His career, 23 years with Aurafly, working his way up from ramp agent to shift supervisor, the pension that was supposed to vest in 7 years, the health insurance that covered his daughter's asthma medication, the mortgage on the house in Jersey that he'd finally almost paid off. All of it was evaporating in real time. And it was his fault. Karen Whitmore stood beside him, her face a grotesque canvas of disbelief and terror. She was looking at Imani and Zuri not as troublemakers now, not as suspicious characters or red flags, but as the avatars of a destruction so complete and so thorough that she couldn't yet fully comprehend its scope. David, she whispered, her voice cracking. David, he can't really... He can, David said hollowly. He just did. Around them, other Aurafly staff were beginning to react to the radio announcement. Gate agents looked up from their computers confused. A pilot walking toward his gate stopped mid-stride, his hand going to his own radio. A flight attendant wheeling her suitcase toward a departure gate froze her expression, shifting from confusion to alarm. And then Jennifer Rodriguez arrived. She came power-walking across the terminal floor, her heels clicking with sharp staccato urgency against the polished tile. Jennifer was the Terminal 4 Operations Director, a woman known throughout JFK for her unflappable demeanor and her ability to handle any crisis with calm efficiency. She'd managed weather delays, mechanical failures, medical emergencies, and labor disputes without breaking a sweat. Right now, her face was a mask of barely controlled panic. Price. Whitmore. My office. Now she barked without breaking stride. She was 15 feet away when she actually looked at the twins standing by the counter, their boarding passes still not printed, their passports still in Imani's hand. Jennifer's brain, trained by decades in the airline industry to connect dots quickly, put the pieces together in an instant. The code red. The grounding order. Williams Aviation Capital. The twin black girls standing at position 3 with David and Karen, looking like they'd seen a ghost. She stopped walking. Her expression shifted from panic to horrified understanding. Oh my God, she breathed. You're the Williams daughters. Imani simply nodded, her face unreadable. Jennifer closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them, her professional veneer had cracked completely. Oh, dear God, she whispered again, pressing her fingers to her temple like she was trying to stave off a migraine. What did you two do? She spun toward the nearest gate agent, a young man named Tommy who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. You. Get these young ladies their boarding passes printed immediately. Escort them to the Celeste Lounge personally. Get them anything they want. Water, champagne, food, a new car. I don't care. Just do it. Now. Tommy scrambled to comply, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Jennifer grabbed Karen and David by their upper arms, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her size. She steered them away from the counter toward the back offices, but her voice carried clearly across the terminal as she hissed, You two just torpedoed the entire airline. Do you understand that? The entire airline. Karen tried to pull away. I was following protocol. The system flagged them. I was just doing my job. Your job. Jennifer's voice rose to a near shriek before she caught herself and lowered it to a furious whisper. Your job was to check in ticketed passengers. Your job was to provide customer service. Your job was not to publicly humiliate the daughters of the man who owns 81 of our 92 aircraft. David opened his mouth to speak, but Jennifer cut him off with a slashing gesture. Save it. Save every word for the lawyers, because that's who you'll be talking to next. She marched them toward the administrative offices, leaving the twins standing at the counter while Tommy printed their boarding passes with trembling hands. I am so sorry, Tommy stammered as the machine hummed and whirred. I don't know what. I'm really sorry. It's not your fault, Zuri said quietly. The boarding passes emerged from the printer. Tommy handed them over like they were made of gold leaf and crystal. The Celeste Lounge is on the upper level past Security Checkpoint 3. I can walk you there, or if you'd prefer. We can find it, Imani said, her voice gentle. Tommy looked like he was about to cry from stress and second-hand embarrassment. Thank you. They took their boarding passes and passports and walked toward security, leaving behind a counter area that had descended into barely controlled chaos. Other passengers were pulling out their phones, checking flight statuses, seeing the red, canceled notifications spreading across Orifly's entire departure board like a virus. The crisis was no longer contained to Position 3. It was spreading, growing, metastasizing into something that would consume the entire airline before the day was done. The Celeste Lounge on the upper level of Terminal 4 was designed to be an oasis of calm. Plush leather chairs, soft lighting, a self-service bar with premium liquor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, complimentary high-speed Wi-Fi and noise-canceling headphones available at the front desk. Under normal circumstances, it would have been peaceful. These were not normal circumstances. When Imani and Zuri entered, the atmosphere was hushed but tense. Business travelers sat hunched over their phones and laptops, refreshing flight status pages with increasing frequency and growing alarm. A woman in a designer suit was speaking urgently into her phone in French, her voice rising with each sentence. A man in a Patagonia vest was arguing with someone on his Bluetooth headset about missing a critical board meeting. Everywhere confusion reigned. The word delayed had started appearing next to Orifly flights, then canceled. At first it was just a few, then more. Then the entire departure board, every single Orifly flight, began flipping to blood-red cancellation notices. What do you mean, indefinitely? A woman demanded of no one in particular, staring at her phone. I have a wedding in London tomorrow. Some issue with the planes, someone else muttered. They're saying it's a maintenance thing. All of them at once. That doesn't make sense. The twins found 2 seats in a quiet corner away from the growing chaos. An attendant appeared almost immediately, offering them water, coffee, tea, anything they wanted. They declined politely. Zuri accepted a bottle of sparkling water but didn't open it. It sat on the table between them, condensation forming on the glass while they sat in silence. The victory felt hollow, pyrrhic. They'd won, objectively, definitively won. Karen and David were finished. The airline was on its knees. Their father had wielded his power like a precision weapon and struck exactly where it would hurt most. But around them, the collateral damage was mounting. A young couple sat nearby the woman, crying softly into her hands while her partner rubbed her back. They'd been heading to Miami for their honeymoon. A businessman paced the length of the lounge, voice growing louder as he explained to someone on the phone that he was going to miss a merger negotiation that had taken 6 months to arrange. An elderly man sat alone, staring at his phone with an expression of quiet devastation. His daughter's graduation was tomorrow in Chicago, and he'd already missed his grandson's last year. Zuri watched a young boy, maybe 6 years old, press his face against the window, looking out at an Orifly plane that sat motionless at the gate stairs. Pulled away, no crew boarding, going nowhere. His mother knelt beside him, trying to explain in simple terms why they couldn't go visit Grandma after all. Dad didn't have to do that, Zuri said quietly, not looking at her sister. Imani's response was sharp, defensive. What else was he supposed to do? Let them call security on us. Let Karen get away with it, I know, But Zuri gestured vaguely at the lounge, at the crying woman, at the boy at the window. Grounding the whole airline. All these people. That's on them, Imani insisted, though, even as she said it, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. On Airline. They created the culture that let someone like Karen thrive. For how many years did Dad say she'd been there? 14. 14 years? 14 years of doing this to people who didn't have a father who could fight back. Zuri turned to look at her sister. And that makes this okay. All these people suffering because of what she did to us. Imani didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Because the truth was complicated and messy and didn't fit neatly into the categories of right and wrong that debate tournaments had taught her to navigate. Their Flight 825 to Nassau remained on the departure board, mockingly listed as on time. It was the only Airline flight in the entire system that hadn't been canceled. Their Boeing 737 sat at the gate like an island in an ocean of paralysis, waiting for 2 passengers, while hundreds of other planes sat grounded because of those same 2 passengers. I don't know if it's okay, Imani finally said, but I know we didn't create this situation. We bought tickets, we showed up, we were polite, we followed every rule, and we were still treated like criminals. So the punishment fits the crime. I don't know. Imani's voice rose slightly, drawing a few glances from nearby passengers. She lowered it. I don't know, but I know what Dad taught us. That power used to protect the people you love isn't wrong. That sometimes the only way to get heard is to make enough noise that they can't ignore you. Zuri looked back out at the tarmac, at the grounded planes, at the chaos spreading through the terminal below. We definitely made noise. On the television mounted in the corner of the lounge, a breaking news alert flashed across the screen. CNN. Developing story. Major airline ground stop. A reporter stood outside an airport looked like Atlanta, explaining that Airline had halted all operations worldwide due to what the airline was calling an unprecedented contractual dispute with an aircraft lessor. Imani's phone buzzed. A text from their father. Are you safe? She typed back. Yes. In the lounge. Our flight is still scheduled. Good. Stay there. I'll handle everything else. She showed the text to Zuri, who read it and shook her head slowly. He really did it. He actually grounded an entire airline. Yeah, Imani said quietly. He really did. Across the lounge, a gate agent in Airline uniform appeared, looking harried and overwhelmed. He made an announcement that was barely audible over the growing din of angry passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the inconvenience. Airline is experiencing an operational issue that has resulted in the temporary suspension of our flight operations. We are working to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. Please check your flight status on the app or at the gate. We will provide updates as they become available. Temporary, someone scoffed. Right. The gate agent fled before anyone could ask him questions he clearly had no answers to. Imani and Zuri sat in their corner, untouched water bottles on the table, watching the consequences of their father's decision ripple outward in real time. They'd been vindicated, protected, defended, but the victory tasted like ash, and neither of them could quite bring themselves to celebrate. 300 miles away in Dallas, Texas, in the executive suite on the 14th floor of Airline's corporate headquarters, CEO Lawrence Hampton was having the worst day of his professional life. He stood at his office window looking out at the late afternoon sun glinting off the wings of planes at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. His tie hung loose around his neck. His sleeves were rolled up. The conference table behind him was covered with laptops. Tablets, phones, every screen showing the same nightmare in different fonts read. Canceled, grounded, chaos. His phone had been ringing non-stop for the past 20 minutes. The board of directors, investors, the Department of Transportation, the FAA, international aviation authorities. every single one of them demanding to know what the hell was happening and why Lawrence hadn't prevented it. But the call that mattered most, the call that had started all of this, had come 14 minutes ago from Desmond Williams himself. Lawrence had known Desmond for 8 years. They'd negotiated lease agreements. They'd shared scotch at industry conferences. They'd played golf. Lawrence had thought stupidly, arrogantly, that they had a good working relationship. And then Desmond Williams had called and spent exactly 5 minutes explaining in a voice that was terrifyingly calm how one of Lawrence's gate agents had publicly humiliated his teenage daughters at JFK, how a supervisor had threatened to call security on them, how his company had failed so completely and so thoroughly to train its staff that it had created a culture where discrimination wasn't just possible, it was standard operating procedure. Lawrence had tried to interrupt, tried to apologize, tried to explain that this was a single bad actor, an isolated incident, something that would be dealt with immediately. Desmond had let him finish, and then he'd said in that same quiet, lethal voice, "Your brand is toxic, Lawrence, and you've allowed it to poison my family. Fix it, now." And then he'd hung up. That's when the ground stop order had come through. That's when Lawrence had learned that 81 of his 92 aircraft, nearly his entire operational fleet, were now sitting idle, costing him approximately $47,000 per minute in lost revenue, stranded passengers' crew overtime, and regulatory fees. His chief legal officer, Margaret Chen, sat at the conference table with 3 lawyers from the firm they kept on retainer for exactly these kinds of disasters. They'd been reviewing the Williams Aviation Capital lease agreements for the past 10 minutes, and their expressions had gone from concerned to grim to absolutely horrified. "Can he really do this?" Lawrence demanded, even though he already knew the answer. Margaret looked up from the contract, her face ashen. "Not only can he do this, Lawrence, we don't have a single legal avenue to challenge it. The brand integrity covenant is ironclad. His lawyers wrote it, we signed it, and we just violated it in the most public documented way possible. A gate agent made a mistake. A gate agent with 14 years of similar complaints in her file made a mistake," Margaret corrected sharply. A supervisor backed her up, and both of them threatened to call security on the daughters of our single largest lessor. This isn't a mistake. This is a pattern, and Desmond Williams has us by the throat. Lawrence slammed his hand on the desk, making everyone in the room jump. A single gate agent. One person. And she brings down the entire company. "No," Margaret said coldly. "You did. Every time you let HR bury a discrimination complaint with a travel voucher instead of training. Every time you promoted supervisors who valued on-time departures over human dignity. Every time you built a culture that taught staff to suspect first and verify never. You built this Lawrence. That gate agent was just the match that lit the fuse." The room fell silent except for the muffled ringing of phones outside the office where Lawrence's assistant was fielding calls from reporters, passengers, and increasingly angry members of Congress who had constituents stranded at airports across the country. "What are my options?" Lawrence asked, his voice flat. "You have 2, Margaret said. Option 1, fight him in court. Tie this up in litigation for years, during which time he keeps your planes grounded. Your stock price collapses, you lose your landing slots, your competitors swoop in to pick up your routes, and you're bankrupt inside of 3 months. And option 2, you give him everything he wants." Lawrence closed his eyes. "Everything. He doesn't want money, Lawrence. If he wanted money, we could negotiate. He wants structural change. He wants to rip out the culture that allowed this to happen and rebuild it from scratch. And he wants to make an example of us so loud and so public that no other airline ever makes the same mistake." "What does that look like?" Margaret consulted her notes. "Based on the preliminary conversation with his legal team, we're looking at terminated lease agreements on our most profitable routes, which will immediately go to a competitor. Mandatory bias training for every employee not designed by us, but by his chosen firm. a massive donation to a foundation he's setting up for legal aid in discrimination cases, and a public apology, televised, from you, specifically naming his daughters and detailing exactly what happened. That will destroy our brand. Your brand is already destroyed, Margaret said bluntly. There's a video. Did you know that some passenger filmed the whole thing? It's been uploaded. It's going viral as we speak. By tomorrow morning, every news outlet in the country will be running it. Your choice isn't between protecting your brand and destroying it. Your choice is between controlled demolition and complete collapse. Lawrence walked to the window again, looking out at the planes. His planes. Except they weren't his planes. They were Desmond Williams's planes. They'd always been Desmond Williams's planes. Lawrence had just been renting them, and he'd catastrophically forgotten that the landlord could always demand his property back. Get me Jennifer Rodriguez at JFK, he said quietly. And get me the personnel file on Karen Whitmore. Every complaint, every review, every single piece of paper we have on her. What are you going to do? Option 2, Lawrence said. All of it, whatever he wants. And I want that gate agent and her supervisor fired before I make the next phone call. Not suspended, terminated. Badge confiscated, access revoked, escorted from the building. I want it done in the next 5 minutes. Margaret nodded and began making calls. Lawrence looked at his reflection in the window glass and saw a man who'd just learned what real power looked like. While executives in Dallas scrambled to contain a crisis that was already far beyond containment, Imani and Zuri sat in the Celeste lounge watching their actions ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. The lounge had transformed from an oasis of calm into a pressure cooker of frustration and confusion. More passengers kept arriving, some angry, some tearful, all demanding answers that the overwhelmed lounge staff simply didn't have. A man in an expensive suit was shouting into his phone about missing a deposition. A woman clutched a small gift bag that said, "It's a boy" on the side, tears streaming down her face as she explained to someone that she was going to miss the birth of her first grandchild. A college student sat alone in the corner, staring blankly at her laptop screen, where a job interview invitation glowed an interview scheduled for tomorrow in San Francisco that she now had no way of getting to. Zuri felt each story like a physical weight. She was an artist. She felt things deeply, viscerally. She saw the world in colors and emotions, and right now the entire lounge was painted in shades of anger and grief and disappointment. "I can't watch this," she whispered. Imani reached over and took her sister's hand. "Then don't look. How can you just sit here because I don't know what else to do?" Imani's voice was quiet, honest. "What do you want me to do?" "Zuri, go apologize. Tell them it's our fault. Tell them that we should have just accepted being humiliated and let Dad's corporate account get flagged and missed our program because a gate agent decided we didn't belong." "No," Zuri said. "But I want to feel like we didn't just ruin hundreds of people's lives." "We didn't. Karen Whitmore did. David Price did. Orifly's corporate culture did. We were just the catalyst." "That's a pretty thin line." "Yeah," Imani agreed. "It is." On the television in the corner, the news coverage had expanded. A financial analyst was explaining the implications of a major airline grounding its entire fleet. Stock ticker showed Orifly's share price in freefall down 31% in the last hour. A legal expert was speculating about breach of contract and corporate liability. A civil rights activist was being interviewed about the systemic. The word caught in Imani's throat. Systemic. The pattern of discrimination that Karen Whitmore represented. The 14 years of complaints that had been swept under the corporate rug with travel vouchers and empty apologies. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. She clicked it and found herself staring at a video. The thumbnail showed her and Zuri at the Orifly counter. The title, Black Teens Denied Boarding at JFK, What Happened Next, will shock you. "We're on the news," she said hollowly. Zuri looked over at the phone. The video had already been viewed 2.4 million times. It had been posted 23 minutes ago. Imani clicked play. The video had been shot by Marcus Chen, the tech entrepreneur who'd been standing behind them in line. It started with her polite greeting to Karen. It showed Karen's dismissive wave, her refusal to look at the confirmation email, her smug assertion that the system doesn't glitch. It captured Zuri's frustration, David Price's weak defense, the threat to call security. Every coded insult, every microaggression, every moment of casual cruelty crystal clear in high-definition video with perfect audio. The comments were flooding in faster than she could read them. "This is disgusting. I fly Orifly all the time. Not anymore. Those poor girls. The way that agent is smiling while she humiliates them makes me sick. Somebody find out who she is. Is there an update? Did they get on their flight?" And then about 5 minutes into scrolling, she found a comment that made her breath catch. Update. The girl's father owns the leasing company for most of Orifly's planes. He just grounded the entire airline, every flight, worldwide. The replies to that comment? Holy shit. Is that legal? It is if they breached their contract. Good. Burn it all down. What about all the passengers? What about 14 years of complaints about this agent that were ignored? The debate was already raging. Thousands of people weighing in on whether Desmond Williams was a hero or a villain, whether the response was justified or excessive, whether the collateral damage mattered more than the principle. Imani closed the video and set her phone face down on the table. "It's already bigger than us," she said. Zuri nodded slowly. It was always going to be. Around them, the chaos continued to build. But in their corner, the twins sat in silence, processing the fact that their humiliation, their father's rage, and their collective power had just become a national conversation. And there was no taking it back. Back in Dallas, Lawrence Hampton's assistant had finally managed to get Jennifer Rodriguez on a secure line from JFK. The terminal operations director's voice came through the speakerphone, sounding brittle and strained. "Mr. Hampton, I've already terminated Whitmore and Price. Security escorted them out 6 minutes ago. Their access has been revoked. I'm prepared to issue a formal statement." "I don't want a statement from you," Lawrence interrupted. "I want to know how this happened. I want to know how a gate agent with 17 documented complaints was still working our premium counters. I want to know how a supervisor thought it was appropriate to threaten teenage girls with security. And I want to know why nobody in the entire chain of command thought to question whether our training and oversight was adequate." Silence on the other end of the line. "Jennifer, you're still there?" "Yes, sir. Do you have an answer?" More silence. Then quietly, "Because we prioritized efficiency over everything else. We measured success in on-time departures and passenger throughput and revenue per available seat mile. We didn't measure it in how many people we made feel welcome. We didn't measure it in dignity." Lawrence closed his eyes. She was right. Every word was right. He'd spent 15 years as CEO building an airline that ran like clockwork, that posted consistent quarterly earnings that made shareholders happy. And in the process, he'd built a culture where Karen Whitmores could thrive for 14 years because they were efficient. They processed passengers quickly, and they rarely made mistakes with baggage. The fact that they made people feel small, unwelcome, suspected that never factored into their performance reviews. "Send me everything," Lawrence said. "Every complaint we've ever received about discrimination profiling or bias. From passengers and from staff. I want to know the full scope of what we're dealing with." "Sir, that's going to be hundreds, thousands, I know. Send it anyway. I'm announcing a full operational review within the hour, and I need to know exactly how deep this rot goes." He ended the call and turned to Margaret. "Draft an apology. Not a corporate statement. A real apology. I'm going on camera tomorrow morning and I'm going to say exactly what happened and exactly whose fault it is. The board won't like that. The board can sue me. Right now, our stock is in freefall. We have planes sitting on tarmacs across 6 continents, and the single largest lessor in our portfolio is prepared to destroy us unless we demonstrate fundamental change. The board's approval is the least of my concerns. Margaret nodded and began typing. Lawrence's chief operations officer, David Brennan, appeared in the doorway. We've got a bigger problem. The ground crew union is demanding answers. They're saying we can't just ground planes without explanation. They want to know if this is a precursor to layoffs. Tell them it's not. They want it in writing. Then, put it in writing. Tell them we're experiencing a contractual dispute with a lessor. We expect it to be resolved within 48 hours, and nobody is losing their jobs over this. Tell them. Lawrence stopped, rubbed his face with both hands. Tell them the truth. Tell them that this company failed its passengers and its staff, and we're making changes. Big ones. Starting now. David looked skeptical but nodded and left. The phone rang again. Lawrence's assistant poked her head in. It's the Secretary of Transportation's office. Of course it is. Lawrence picked up. This is Hampton. The conversation that followed was brief and excruciating. The DOT wanted a full report on the ground stop within 2 hours. They wanted to know if there were safety issues. They wanted to know if this would impact other carriers. They wanted assurances that passengers were being taken care of. Lawrence gave them what assurances he could and hung up feeling like he'd just swallowed broken glass. Margaret looked up from her laptop. The apology is drafted. Do you want to review it? Read it to me. She cleared her throat. I want to speak directly to Amani and Zuri Williams. What happened to you at JFK today was inexcusable. It was not a system error. It was not a misunderstanding. It was discrimination. And it happened because we built a culture that allowed it to happen. For that, I am deeply personally sorry. Orifly is sorry, and we will do better. We must do better. We will do better. Lawrence listened, then shook his head. It's too corporate. It sounds like it was written by lawyers. It was written by lawyers. Then make it sound like it was written by a human being who actually feels remorse. Because I do, Margaret. I feel like I want to crawl into a hole. Those girls are 17. They worked their entire lives to earn those seats, and my employee made them feel like criminals for existing. So write it again, and this time write it like you're apologizing to your own daughter. Margaret's expression softened slightly. She deleted what she'd written and started over. Lawrence walked back to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Beautiful. Indifferent. The sky didn't care that his company was imploding. The planes sitting idle on the tarmac didn't care. The only people who cared were the ones being hurt, the passengers, the employees, his daughters at home who were going to see their father's name dragged through the news cycle for weeks. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife. I saw the news. Are you okay? He typed back, no, but I will be. Another buzz. This time from an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't open it, assuming it was a reporter who'd gotten his cell number somehow. But curiosity got the better of him. The message was short. Mr. Hampton, this is Desmond Williams. We'll speak tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss terms. In the meantime, your daughters can fly. Just them, no one else. You have 28 hours to demonstrate that you're capable of change. Don't waste them. Lawrence stared at the message for a long moment, then showed it to Margaret. 28 hours, she said. Then we better get to work. They did. Karen Whitmore and David Price sat in Jennifer Rodriguez's office, separated by 6 feet of government-issue carpet and a chasm of mutual blame. Security had escorted them from the terminal floor to the administrative wing in silence. Other employees had watched them pass, some with sympathy, most with the kind of horrified fascination people reserve for car accidents. Everyone knew. The radio chatter had spread the news faster than any official announcement could. The gate agent and supervisor from Position 3 had done something so catastrophic that it had grounded the entire airline. Jennifer sat behind her desk, her face carved from stone. She'd pulled their personnel files and had them open on her computer screen. 17 complaints for Karen, 12 for David, though his were different. Not active discrimination, but failures to intervene, failures to supervise, failures to question when questioning was needed. "I was following protocol," Karen said for the 4th time, her voice rising with each repetition. "The system flagged them." "I didn't make that up." "The computer doesn't flag people based on their race," Jennifer interrupted coldly. "The computer flagged an account, a legitimate corporate account that has been in good standing for 8 years. You decided based on nothing but your own prejudice that 2 black teenagers couldn't possibly have legitimate first-class tickets. You decided that before you even spoke to them." "I don't have a prejudiced bone in my body," Karen shot back, her face flushing red. "I've checked in thousands of passengers, all kinds. I don't see color." "You see it just fine," Jennifer said. "You see it in every one of these 17 complaints. Agent seemed hostile toward my family. Agent questioned my right to be in business class. Agent made me feel unwelcome. Every single one from passengers of color. Every single one." Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for a defense that wouldn't come. "I want union representation," she finally said. "You can't just fire me without due process." "Actually, I can," Jennifer replied. "Because this isn't a disciplinary issue. This is a breach of contract between Orifly and our lessor. You are the breach, Karen. You personally violated the terms of an agreement worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Your union can't protect you from that." She turned to David. "And you. You stood there and backed her up. You had 17 years of complaints in front of you, a supervisor's authority to override an agent, and 2 teenage girls showing you confirmation emails proving their legitimacy. And you chose to threaten them with security." David, who'd been sitting silently with his head in his hands, finally looked up. How was I supposed to know who their father was? The question hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. "You weren't supposed to know," Jennifer said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle in its contempt. "You were supposed to help ticketed passengers board their flight. You were supposed to question why an automated system was flagging a legitimate account. You were supposed to use your judgment and your authority to solve problems, not create them. Their father's identity should have been irrelevant. But it wasn't irrelevant," David said bitterly. "Because if they'd been some random passengers without connections, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." Jennifer leaned back in her chair. "You're right. If they'd been random passengers, you probably would have gotten away with it. Just like Karen got away with it 17 times before. Just like you've gotten away with being a terrible supervisor for years. But that's the problem, David. The fact that it took the CEO of our largest lessor to make us care about discrimination is exactly why we deserve everything that's happening to us right now." She opened a drawer and pulled out 2 envelopes. "These are your termination letters. Effective immediately, your final paycheck will be direct deposited according to company policy. Your health care coverage ends at midnight tonight. If you want COBRA information, HR will send it to your home address." Karen snatched her envelope like it had personally offended her. "This is illegal. I'm going to sue away," Jennifer said. "You'll lose. You violated company policy, you violated federal anti-discrimination law, and you cost this company somewhere in the vicinity of $1 billion. Any lawyer worth their retainer will tell you to walk away and count yourself lucky you're not facing criminal charges." "Criminal charges?" Karen's voice went shrill. "I didn't do anything criminal." "Yet," Jennifer said ominously. "But the DOT is investigating. The FAA is investigating. And there are lawyers right now trying to figure out if what you did rises to the level of violating civil rights statutes. So, my advice, take your termination letter. Go home, delete your social media, and pray that this stays in civil court. Security appeared in the doorway. 2 officers in dark blue uniforms with impassive expressions. Escort them out, Jennifer said. Make sure their badges are collected and their system access is revoked before they leave the building. As Karen and David were led away, Jennifer sat alone in her office listening to the muffled sounds of an airline in crisis. Angry passengers, ringing phones, the overhead speaker announcing another cancellation. She closed their personnel files and allowed herself just for a moment to feel the weight of it all. Then she picked up the phone and got back to work. Marcus Chen hadn't intended to become the documenter of a moment that would reshape an industry. He'd just been standing in line at JFK running on 3 hours of sleep after a red-eye from San Francisco waiting to check in for his flight to London, where his startup was about to close a Series B funding round. But when he'd seen Karen Whitmore's face as she looked at those 2 teenage girls, the suspicion, the dismissiveness, the casual cruelty, something in him had recognized it. He'd seen that look before. His parents had seen it. His grandparents had seen it. It was the look of someone who'd appointed themselves gatekeeper and was enjoying the power a little too much. So he'd started recording. Now, 3 hours later, that recording had been viewed 11.4 million times. Marcus sat in a hotel room near Heathrow he'd managed to get on a United flight after Orifly had imploded, watching his phone light up with notifications every 3 seconds. The video had been picked up by every major news network. Cable news was running it on loop. Social media was on fire. The video itself was damning in its simplicity. It started with Imani's polite voice. "Hi, we're checking in for Flight 825 to Nassau." It showed Karen's dismissive handwave. "I don't look at passenger phones. It's a security risk." It captured Zuri's trembling request to speak to a supervisor, David Price's arrival, and his weak, bureaucratic response. The threat to call security. But what made it truly viral was the ending. Marcus had kept recording through the phone call. The speakerphone announcement from Desmond Williams. The moment David Price's face went white. The radio call announcing the ground stop. The entire arc of power shifting captured in 8 minutes and 43 seconds of shaky phone footage. The comments section had become its own ecosystem of outrage debate and increasingly detailed internet detective work. Someone had identified Karen Whitmore within the first hour. Her full name, her age, her neighborhood in Queens. Her Facebook page had been found screenshotted and dissected. Photos of her at a Trump rally. A post from 2019 complaining about illegals taking our jobs. A comment on a friend's post about Black Lives Matter that said, "All lives matter." Why is that controversial? David Price's LinkedIn had been found, his employment history analyzed, his recommendations read and judged. Marcus watched the internet do what the internet does. Find everything. Judge everything. Miss nothing. Part of him felt guilty for enabling it. Part of him felt like maybe, just maybe, this was accountability in the modern age. His phone rang. A producer from CNN. "Mr. Chen, we'd love to have you on tonight to discuss what you witnessed." "No, thank you," Marcus said politely and hung up. He didn't want to be part of the story. He just wanted the story to be told. On Twitter, the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack was trending #1 worldwide. People were sharing their own experiences. A black doctor who'd been questioned about sitting in first class despite her medical conference badge. A Latino family who'd been separated and searched because a flight attendant thought they looked suspicious. An elderly Asian woman who'd been asked repeatedly if she spoke English despite being born in California. The stories poured in. Hundreds, thousands. A decade of small humiliations, casual cruelties, and barely concealed prejudice bubbling to the surface because 2 teenage girls had finally been able to fight back. But there was a counter-narrative emerging too. People defending Karen saying she was just doing her job. People criticizing Desmond Williams for overreacting and punishing innocent passengers. People arguing that grounding an entire airline was disproportionate, excessive the action of an out-of-touch billionaire who didn't care about collateral damage. A conservative pundit on Fox News. This is what happens when we let political correctness run wild. A gate agent follows procedure and suddenly an entire airline is shut down because someone's feelings were hurt. A progressive commentator on MSNBC. This is what accountability looks like. For years, people of color have been quietly absorbing this treatment. Now, finally, there are consequences that can't be ignored. The debate raged across every platform, every news cycle, every dinner table conversation in America. But for Marcus, sitting in his hotel room watching it unfold, one comment stuck with him. It was buried deep in a Reddit thread posted by someone with the username former_airline_employee. I worked for a major carrier for 12 years. I watched agents like Karen get complaint after complaint, and nothing ever happened. You know why? Because they were efficient. They processed passengers quickly. They didn't make mistakes with tickets or baggage. And the airline industry has been optimized for efficiency, not humanity. We measure everything in minutes and dollars. We don't measure how many people we make feel welcome. We don't measure dignity. So yeah, Karen Whitmore is a symptom, but Orifly is the disease. And maybe it took a billionaire shutting down the whole operation to force us to admit that. Marcus screenshotted the comment and sent it to his wife with a simple message. This, she wrote back, "Are you going to be okay? This is getting intense." "I don't know," he typed honestly, "but I think it needed to happen." Across the Atlantic in the Bahamas, Imani and Zuri had arrived at their hotel. Flight 825 had departed on time, the only Orifly flight in the entire global network to do so. The pilot had made a brief announcement before takeoff. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have you aboard today. Let's have a safe flight." Everyone on the plane had known who they were. Some passengers had nodded respectfully. Others had stared with undisguised curiosity. A few had whispered among themselves, debating whether the twins were heroes or entitled brats whose father had thrown a corporate tantrum. Now in their hotel room, they sat on adjacent beds with their phones watching themselves become a national conversation. "We're on the cover of the New York Times website," Zuri said, her voice hollow. The headline, "When Discrimination Met Power: How a Gate Agent's Decision Grounded an Airline." The article was surprisingly balanced. It detailed the incident. It provided context about Desmond Williams and his company. It included statements from aviation experts about lease agreements and corporate liability. It quoted civil rights advocates. It interviewed stranded passengers. But what struck Imani most was the closing paragraph. The question at the heart of this incident is not whether Desmond Williams had the legal right to ground Orifly's fleet. Clearly he did. The question is whether having the power to do something makes it the right thing to do. And the answer to that question may depend entirely on whether you've ever been on the receiving end of the kind of treatment that Imani and Zuri Williams experienced, or whether you're currently stranded at an airport because of their father's response to it. Imani read it twice, then set her phone down. "You think we did the right thing?" Zuri asked. "I think we did the only thing we could," Imani replied. "That's not the same thing." "No," Imani agreed. "It's not." 36 hours after the ground stop began, Desmond Williams and Lawrence Hampton sat across from each other in a conference room at Williams Aviation Capital's Manhattan headquarters. Between them sat lawyers, executives, and a document that would reshape an airline. The grounding had cost Orifly, by conservative estimates, $127 million in direct losses. Stock value had plummeted by 28%, erasing nearly $1 billion in market capitalization. Landing slots had been forfeited to competitors. Crew scheduling was in shambles. The lawsuits from angry passengers were already being filed by the hundreds. But the financial damage, catastrophic as it was, wasn't what brought Lawrence Hampton to this table. What brought him here was the knowledge that Desmond Williams could keep his planes grounded for weeks if he wanted to, could bleed Orifly dry, could destroy the company entirely, and would if Lawrence didn't give him what he wanted. The settlement terms are non-negotiable, Desmond said, his voice calm and businesslike. This wasn't personal for him, not anymore. The protection of his daughters had been personal. This was structural. This was about making sure it never happened again. Lawrence nodded, his face haggard from 2 nights without sleep. I understand. Margaret Chen, sitting beside Lawrence, slid the document across the table. We've reviewed the terms. We accept them in full. The terms were brutal. Lease termination. Williams Aviation Capital would immediately terminate the leases on 25 Airbus A321neo aircraft, the newest, most fuel-efficient planes in Orifly's fleet, the backbone of their transatlantic operation. These aircraft would be released to United Airlines, Orifly's largest domestic competitor, effectively handing them prime routes and market share on a silver platter. Mandatory training. Every single Orifly employee, all 18,000 of them, from baggage handlers to executives, would undergo intensive bias and de-escalation training. The program wouldn't be designed by Orifly's HR department or run by their usual corporate training vendors. It would be designed and administered by Fairway Consulting Group, a firm that specialized in rooting out organizational discrimination and had a reputation for being ruthlessly thorough. Orifly would pay for it. Completion would be mandatory for continued employment. The Williams Foundation Orifly would make a single payment of $75 million to establish the Williams Foundation for Equitable Travel, the foundation's mission to provide legal aid support and advocacy for people who faced discrimination in travel and hospitality but lacked the resources to fight back. Desmond's daughters would run it. Public Accountability CEO Lawrence Hampton would issue a full, unequivocal public apology. Not a press release, not a statement read by a spokesperson. A televised address where he would personally name Imani and Zuri Williams, detail exactly what happened to them, acknowledge Orifly's corporate failures, and outline the specific steps being taken to ensure it never happened again. Lawrence signed each page without reading them. He'd already read them a dozen times. He knew what they said. He knew what they meant. Desmond watched him sign, his expression unreadable. When the last signature was in place, Desmond stood and extended his hand. Lawrence stood and shook it. Your daughters will never have to worry about flying Orifly again? Lawrence said quietly. I'll make sure of it. It's not just my daughters I want you to worry about, Desmond replied. It's everyone's daughters, everyone's sons, everyone who should be able to buy a ticket and board a plane without having to prove they deserve to be there. Lawrence nodded. Understood. 2 hours later, the ground stop was lifted. Orifly planes began moving again. Passengers began boarding. The airline industry exhaled. But nothing would ever be quite the same. That evening, Lawrence Hampton sat in a television studio in Dallas, a small microphone clipped to his tie, bright lights making him squint. A teleprompter displayed the words he'd written himself, revised 17 times, and finally accepted as adequate, even though they still felt insufficient. The camera's red light blinked on. Good evening. Lawrence began, looking directly into the lens. My name is Lawrence Hampton, and I'm the CEO of Orifly. 2 days ago, 2 of our employees publicly humiliated 2 teenage girls at John F. Kennedy International Airport. I'm here tonight to tell you exactly what happened, why it happened, and what we're doing to make sure it never happens again. He paused, took a breath, and continued. Imani and Zuri Williams are 17 years old. They're honor students. They're scholarship recipients. They had legitimate first-class tickets to fly to the Bahamas for an educational program they'd earned through years of hard work, and our gate agent decided based on nothing but their appearance that they didn't belong. She flagged their account. She refused to check them in. and when they asked for help, our supervisor threatened to call security. Lawrence's voice, which had started steady, cracked slightly. This wasn't a system error. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was discrimination. And it happened because I built a culture where efficiency mattered more than dignity, where on-time departures were more important than making people feel welcome, where employees could harbor prejudice for years, accumulating complaint after complaint, and face no real consequences as long as they processed passengers quickly. He looked down at his hands, then back at the camera. Imani, Zuri, I am so deeply sorry for what you experienced. You deserved better. You deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. You deserve to have your tickets accepted without question. You deserve to board your flight without having to prove you belonged there. And on behalf of Orifly, I failed you. The apology continued for another 4 minutes. Lawrence detailed the settlement terms. He announced the training program. He explained the foundation. He promised accountability. And when it was over, he walked out of the studio knowing that his words would be dissected, debated, criticized, and praised in equal measure. Knowing that some people would call it genuine and others would call it damage control. But for the first time in 2 days, he felt like he had done something right. 6 months after the incident at JFK, Karen Whitmore, now calling herself Janet Miller, stood behind the counter of a Quick Mart in Albuquerque, New Mexico, waiting for her shift to end. The severe platinum blonde bob was gone, replaced by mousy brown shoulder-length hair that she cut herself with kitchen scissors every few weeks. The pressed navy uniform had been replaced by a polyester polo shirt with the Quick Mart logo embroidered on the chest. The power to deny someone a boarding pass had been replaced by the power to void a transaction for a bag of chips. Her kingdom had shrunk from Terminal 4 at one of the world's busiest airports to a 12-by-12-foot space that smelled of stale coffee, hot dogs rotating endlessly under heat lamps and floor cleaner. She'd fled New York 3 months after the incident. The house in Queens had become uninhabitable news vans camped on the street. Protesters occasionally gathering on the sidewalk, letters stuffed into her mailbox, ranging from death threats to religious tracts promising hell. Her husband, a sanitation worker who'd done nothing wrong except marry her, had been harassed at work until he'd requested a transfer to a different borough. Her son had been bullied so relentlessly at school that they'd pulled him out and enrolled him in online classes. The viral video had become her digital ghost. Every job application, every interview, every attempt to rebuild someone would Google her name, and there it would be. Karen Whitmore, JFK, the face of American prejudice in the airline industry. Her union had quietly disavowed her. They'd issued a statement saying that while they defended workers' rights, they couldn't defend discriminatory actions. The wrongful termination suit she'd threatened to file had died when 3 different lawyers told her she'd not only lose but likely face countersuits. So she'd changed her name, moved across the country to a place where nobody knew her face, and taken the only job she could find that didn't require references or a background check. The overnight shift at Quick Mart paid $13.50 an hour. It was lonely, sometimes dangerous, and utterly devoid of the small satisfactions she'd once derived from wielding authority. At 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, a young black man came into the store, college age probably. He wore a university sweatshirt and carried a backpack covered in band stickers. He grabbed a Red Bull from the cooler and a pack of gum from the display by the counter. When he swiped his card, the machine beeped. Declined. He sighed, checked his phone banking app, his brow furrowing. That's weird. I just got paid yesterday. Can you try it again? A year ago? Karen Whitmore's mind would have leaped to conclusions. Fraudulent card. Insufficient funds. Another red flag. The old familiar script would have played in her head, and she would have enjoyed just a little his small moment of embarrassment. The ghost of that woman rose up inside her, now whispering its poisonous suggestions. He's lying. His card's stolen. Tell him to leave. But Janet Miller, the woman Karen had become, the woman scraped down to bare essentials by the complete destruction of her old life, just looked at him, saw a tired kid trying to get through a late-night study session. Nothing more, nothing less. Sometimes these machines are slow to catch up with the bank, she said, her voice flat and emotionless, but not unkind. Let's try it again. She ran the card a second time. It went through. Thanks, he said, grabbing his items. Appreciated. He left, and Karen stood alone in the fluorescent hum of the empty store. It wasn't a moment of redemption. She felt no warmth, no sense of having done something good. She had simply done her job without adding cruelty to it. That was the extent of her growth, the ability to not make things worse. But for the first time, she'd recognized the old impulse, the old script, the small, cruel thrill of power that had once defined her. And she'd chosen not to follow it. There was no one to see it, no one to praise her, no one to tell her she was becoming better. And that she realized in the empty quiet of the store was the most bitter karma of all. Not the public shame, not the destroyed career, not the exile. It was being forced to live day after day with the hollowed-out person she'd become, knowing that the old Karen was gone, but that nothing particularly good had risen to replace her. Just this empty, going-through-the-motions existence where the best she could manage was not actively hurting people. She'd spent 14 years at Orifly feeling important, feeling powerful, feeling like she was protecting something valuable. Now she spent her nights selling cigarettes and lottery tickets to insomniacs, and knew with devastating clarity that she'd been protecting nothing but her own small, mean sense of superiority. The rest of her shift passed in silence. At 6 a.m., her replacement arrived, a cheerful woman named Rosa, who didn't know Janet's real name and wouldn't have cared if she did. Karen walked out into the cold New Mexico morning, got on the bus, and rode home to the small apartment she shared with a roommate who worked opposite shifts and whom she barely ever saw. She'd lost everything: her career, her home, her identity, her sense of purpose. And somewhere in New York, in a foundation office in Manhattan, the two girls she'd humiliated were building something meaningful out of that loss. The karma wasn't that she'd been punished. It was that their gain had come from her destruction, and she would spend the rest of her life knowing she'd had a choice to show kindness or to show cruelty, and she'd chosen wrong. David Price's destruction was quieter than Karen's, but no less complete. He wasn't doxxed. His face didn't become a meme. There were no protesters outside his house in Westchester. But in the corporate world, the only world where he'd ever had value, his name became synonymous with cowardice and incompetence. The video had shown him for exactly what he was: a middle manager who'd spent 2 decades climbing the ladder by never making waves, never questioning authority, never standing up for anything that might put his own position at risk. He was the embodiment of complicit mediocrity. Every job application he submitted died in the same place: the background check. His termination from Orifly came with a notation in his file that made it impossible to hide. Terminated for cause failure to intervene in discriminatory action. Threatened customers exercising their rights. The notation was technically accurate and legally airtight. It was also a career death sentence. His wife, who'd built her identity around being married to an airline supervisor with good benefits and a respectable salary, left him 4 months after the termination. She took their daughter and moved in with her sister in Connecticut. David moved into a studio apartment in Newark and took a job managing inventory at a big box store for $18 an hour. He'd spent 23 years learning the complex systems of airline operations, crew scheduling, gate management, federal regulations, customer service protocols. None of it transferred. None of it mattered. What haunted him most wasn't the financial devastation, though that was real and crushing. It wasn't the divorce, though, that hollowed him out in ways he hadn't expected. It was the knowledge that he'd had a choice. He could have listened to the twins, could have looked at their confirmation email and called the corporate booking department to verify it, could have used his authority to override Karen's suspicious instinct, could have been for once in his career the kind of supervisor who protected passengers instead of protecting himself. And he'd chosen not to. He'd stood with Karen because it was easier, because questioning her would have created conflict, because backing up his agent was what supervisors did even when their agents were wrong. He'd chosen the path of least resistance, and it had led him here to a break room in a New Jersey warehouse, eating a packed lunch alone, while his former colleagues were still flying around the world, building careers, living lives. David Price had thought he was building security through decades of careful, risk-averse decisions. He'd actually been building a house of cards, and 2 17-year-old girls had blown it down with a single phone call. The ruins of that house were where he lived now, and where he would likely live for the rest of his professional life. Silent. Forgotten. A cautionary tale that nobody bothered to tell because there were no lessons in his story except the obvious one: stand for something or fall for anything. He'd chosen the latter. 1 year after the incident at JFK, the Williams Foundation for Equitable Travel operated out of a bright, modern office space in Midtown Manhattan, 2 blocks from Desmond Williams's corporate headquarters. Imani and Zuri had deferred their college acceptances. Harvard for Imani, Brown for Zuri, for a gap year dedicated to building something meaningful from their humiliation. It had initially worried their father, who'd spent their entire lives prioritizing education above all else. But when he'd seen the fire in their eyes, the sense of purpose, he'd understood. This was their education, just a different kind. Imani had become the foundation's operational heart. She managed the legal team coordinated with partner law firms across the country and developed the criteria for which cases they'd take. Her debate skills translated perfectly into strategic thinking about litigation and public advocacy. The office had a wall covered in case files. Each one represented a person who'd faced discrimination in travel and hospitality, but lacked the resources or connections to fight back. Their first major case beyond Orifly had involved Rosa Martinez, a 68-year-old grandmother from Phoenix. She'd been barred from boarding a Sky Connect flight to visit her daughter in Seattle because another passenger had reported her as suspicious for speaking Spanish to her 5-year-old granddaughter. The gate agent had asked for additional identification, had questioned whether her ticket was legitimate, had called a supervisor who'd asked to search her bag. All because she'd been speaking Spanish, her first language, the language of her childhood, to a child. When she'd protested, they'd refunded her ticket and escorted her out of the airport. Rosa had filed a complaint with Sky Connect. They'd sent her a $100 travel voucher and a form letter. She'd tried to find a lawyer, but most wouldn't take the case on contingency because the damages were hard to quantify. How do you put a dollar value on missing your daughter's birthday? On being made to feel unwelcome in your own country? That's where the Williams Foundation had stepped in. Imani had flown to Phoenix and spent 4 hours with Rosa and her family listening to her story. Not just the incident at the airport, but the context around it, a lifetime of small slights of being made to feel like her language was a problem of raising children who'd learned to code switch and minimize their heritage to avoid exactly this kind of treatment. They looked at me like I was... Rosa had struggled to find the English words, like I was not belong here, in my own country. Zuri, sitting beside her sister, had filmed the interview. Not for evidence, they had that already, but for something bigger. She'd spent the next 2 weeks producing a short documentary that wove together Rosa's story with interviews from other Latino travelers, from linguists, explaining the psychology of language discrimination, from civil rights attorneys providing legal context. The documentary was called Lost in Translation: The Cost of Speaking Spanish in America. It was 11 minutes long, professionally produced, and heartbreakingly intimate. They'd released it on the same day they'd filed the lawsuit against Sky Connect. The video went viral overnight, Within 48 hours, it had 23 million views. News outlets picked it up. Late-night talk show hosts referenced it. Congressional representatives cited it in speeches about discrimination in transportation. SkyConnect had settled within a week. The settlement terms weren't just about Rosa. The foundation had pushed for structural change, new training protocols, policy revisions that made language discrimination explicitly prohibited, a public apology not just to Rosa, but to every customer who'd ever been made to feel unwelcome for speaking a language other than English. And SkyConnect had agreed to all of it. That had been the template, the formula they'd used again and again over the past year. Find people whose stories represented larger patterns. Build compelling narratives around those stories. Use media and legal pressure simultaneously. Push for settlements that created precedent and policy change, not just monetary damages. They'd handled 14 cases in their first year. Won or settled 12. The 2 they'd lost had been appealed. More importantly, they'd changed behavior. Airlines had started revising their training programs preemptively, terrified of becoming the next viral disaster. Gate agents were being held to higher standards. Supervisors were learning to question automated systems and their own biases. The industry was learning that the Williams Foundation had resources media savvy and no hesitation about making examples of companies that failed their customers. Desmond watched his daughters work with a mixture of pride and melancholy. They'd taken the worst day of their young lives and transmuted it into something powerful. They'd turned pain into purpose. But he also saw the weight they carried. The late nights reviewing case files. The tears Zuri sometimes shed after particularly difficult interviews with discrimination victims. The anger that flickered in Imani's eyes when she read complaint letters that airlines had dismissed with form responses. They'd been forced to grow up fast, to see the world's ugliness clearly, to understand that justice wasn't natural or automatic. It had to be fought for case by case, person by person. One evening, Desmond had stopped by the foundation office to drop off dinner for the twins. They'd been working on a case involving a Sikh man who'd been asked to remove his turban before boarding a religious violation that the airline had defended as security protocol. He'd found them in the conference room, surrounded by legal briefs and documentary footage working through how to frame the case for maximum impact. "You two should go home," he'd said gently. "Get some sleep." Imani had looked up, her eyes tired but determined. 1 more hour. We're close to cracking how to approach this. Desmond had wanted to tell them they were doing too much, that they should be in college living normal lives, not carrying the weight of other people's injustices. But then he'd remembered. He'd built his company with the same intensity, the same refusal to accept the world as it was. He'd worked 18-hour days for a decade because he'd been trying to prove something to himself, to the people who'd underestimated him, to his daughters who were watching. They were his daughters in every sense, including this one. 1 hour, he'd agreed. "Then I'm coming back to drag you both home." They'd smiled, and he'd left them to their work. And as he'd walked back to his car, he'd thought about karma. Not the punitive kind that had destroyed Karen and David, but the generative kind that was building something better from the ashes of something terrible. His daughters had been hurt, and rather than let that hurt define them, they'd used it to protect others from experiencing the same pain. That, Desmond thought, was the most powerful kind of justice. Desmond Williams sat in a board meeting at Williams Aviation Capital headquarters, facing a room full of men and women who'd built their careers on maximizing returns and minimizing risk. They were reviewing a proposed lease agreement with a European low-cost carrier, 120 aircraft over 10 years worth $2.3 billion. It was the kind of deal that would have been rubber-stamped 2 years ago. The numbers were solid. The airline was financially stable. The terms were favorable to WAC. But Desmond was looking at something else. Page 47, he said, his voice cutting through the CFO's presentation. The service-level agreements. They're generic. I want to add specific language about anti-discrimination training, transparent complaint processes, and passenger rights protections. Lawrence Miller, a board member and veteran of finance who'd been with WAC since its early days, leaned back in his chair. Desmond, with all due respect, that's unnecessary. Our business is asset management, not social engineering. If we start adding these kinds of covenants to every deal, we're going to price ourselves out of competitive agreements. Desmond set down his pen and looked directly at Lawrence. Larry, our assets are 300-ton billboards that fly at 500 miles per hour. They carry our name. They represent our brand. And by extension, they represent our values. Every time one of our planes takes off, it's making a statement about who we are and what we stand for. He paused, letting that sink in. We have a vested interest in ensuring that our billboards aren't being used to broadcast hate, incompetence, or discrimination. Last year taught me something critical. Brand integrity isn't a line item on a spreadsheet. It's the bedrock of long-term value. It's what differentiates us from competitors who see aircraft as commodities and passengers as revenue units. Lawrence started to speak, but Desmond continued. When the Orifly incident happened, our phones rang off the hook. Other airlines wanted to know if we'd ground their fleets too if they had similar problems. Investors wanted to know if we were reliable partners or liability risks. Regulators wanted to know if we took our contractual obligations seriously. And we proved that we do. Lawrence argued. We enforced our covenant. Point made. But adding these clauses to every future agreement is essential. Desmond interrupted firmly. Because I don't want to have to ground another airline. I don't want my daughters to have to experience that again. I don't want any passenger to have to experience what they experienced. The way we prevent that isn't by reacting to discrimination after it happens. It's by building contracts that make prevention a requirement. He leaned forward, his voice dropping, but somehow carrying more weight. The covenants stay, Larry. They go in every lease agreement from this point forward. We will require anti-discrimination training. We will require transparent reporting of passenger complaints. We will require regular audits. And if airlines don't want to meet those standards, they can lease from someone else. We'll lose business, another board member said. Then we lose business, Desmond replied calmly. But I would rather run a smaller company with stronger values than a larger company that profits from enabling the kind of behavior we saw at JFK. The room fell silent. Finally, Margaret Chen, the general counsel, spoke up. I've reviewed the proposed covenant language. It's solid. It protects us legally while setting clear expectations. And honestly, in the current regulatory environment, this might actually give us a competitive advantage. Airlines are terrified of being the next viral disaster. Having a lessor that requires and supports strong anti-discrimination practices could be a selling point. Desmond nodded to her gratefully. All in favor of including the enhanced covenants in all future lease agreements, he asked. One by one, hands went up, some more reluctantly than others, but they went up. The motion passed. After the meeting, Lawrence approached Desmond privately. You've changed, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't praise either. Yes, Desmond agreed. I used to think power was about building the biggest company, managing the most assets, posting the strongest returns. And all of that still matters. But I learned something when my daughters were humiliated at JFK. What's that? That true power isn't just the ability to punish after something goes wrong, it's the foresight to prevent it from going wrong in the first place. It's using your position not just to protect your own interests, but to create systems that protect everyone. He looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline at the planes taking off from LaGuardia in the distance. Those planes carry our name. I want that name to mean something more than profit margins. The ripple effects of the JFK incident and the Williams Foundation's subsequent work spread through the airline industry like cracks in ice, slowly at first, then all at once. Within 18 months, 3 major carriers had voluntarily adopted enhanced anti-discrimination training programs, not because they were legally required to, but because the alternative was too risky. The Williams Foundation had made it clear that they were watching, that they had resources, that they would take action. The Department of Transportation, pressured by congressional oversight and public outcry, had launched a comprehensive review of passenger rights and airline discrimination practices. The review had resulted in new reporting requirements. Airlines now had to publicly disclose the number and nature of discrimination complaints they received, broken down by category and demographic information about the complainants. The transparency was uncomfortable. It revealed patterns that airlines had previously been able to hide, but it also created accountability. 6 months after the JFK incident, the Williams Foundation had launched Flight Truth, a mobile app that allowed passengers, whistleblowers, and airline employees to submit anonymous reports of discrimination in real time. The app didn't just collect complaints. It aggregated them, analyzed patterns, and published quarterly reports highlighting which airlines, which airports, and which specific routes had the highest incidence of reported discrimination. The reports were devastating for some carriers. They were also incredibly effective at driving change. Airlines that topped the Flight Truth list found themselves facing investor pressure, regulatory scrutiny, and organized boycotts. Airlines that scored well found themselves with competitive advantages, positive press, customer loyalty, and the ability to recruit better talent. The market was responding, slowly, inefficiently, but unmistakably. When asked by a journalist from The Atlantic what he hoped to gain from all this work, the foundation, the app, the aggressive litigation strategy, Desmond had given an answer that had been quoted widely. Nothing. I already had everything I needed. Success, security, resources. This isn't about gain. This is about what I hope to leave behind. I want my daughters to live in a world where they don't need their father's name to be treated with basic human dignity. I want every person to be able to buy a ticket and board a plane without having to prove they deserve to be there. That's the world I'm trying to build. The quote had been printed on a plaque that hung in the Williams Foundation office, visible to everyone who walked through the doors. Imani had read it every morning for a year, and it still made her throat tight with emotion, because she knew what it had cost her father to say those words, to admit that all his success, all his power, all his carefully built empire hadn't been enough to protect them from 8 minutes of humiliation at an airport counter. But he'd taken that inadequacy and turned it into something constructive. He hadn't just punished the people who'd hurt his daughters. He'd built systems to prevent it from happening to anyone else. The man who'd been told through his daughters that they didn't belong in first class hadn't just reclaimed their seats. He'd redefined what first class would mean for everyone who came after. His legacy wouldn't be that he shut down an airline for 36 hours. It would be that he used those 36 hours to reboot an industry. Imani and Zuri Williams sat in their shared dorm room at Harvard 2 years removed from the incident at JFK and 1 year into their college experience. They'd finally enrolled the foundation, now run by a full-time executive director, while they served on the board and consulted remotely. It was late past midnight, and they should have been sleeping. But they'd just gotten off a video call with their latest case, and sleep felt impossible. The case involved a single mother from Detroit who'd been denied boarding because her young son had a meltdown at the gate. The boy was autistic. The meltdown was triggered by the sensory overload of the airport. But the gate agent had decided the mother couldn't control her child and had denied them boarding, citing safety concerns. The mother had missed her sister's funeral. The foundation had taken the case, won a settlement, and forced the airline to implement new training on disability awareness. They'd won, but the funeral had still been missed. "Do you ever wonder if Dad's way was right?" Zuri asked quietly, staring at the ceiling of their dorm room. Imani turned her head to look at her sister. What do you mean, the grounding? The scale of it? The thousands of people affected? It wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. It probably wouldn't be the last. Every day, Imani admitted. I think about the little boy we saw at the lounge pressing his face against the window. The woman who missed her wedding. The businessman who missed his deal. But then I think about what would have happened if Dad had done nothing. Karen would still be at that counter. David would still be supervising her. Orifly would still be operating exactly the same way. And the next black teenager or Latino family or person with an accent would experience the exact same thing we did. Zuri sat up, pulling her knees to her chest. So the ends justify the means. I don't know if they justify them, Imani said carefully. But I know that systems that protect people like Karen for 14 years create costs, too. They just distribute those costs differently. Across thousands of people over years. Small humiliations. Small injustices. Easy to ignore because they're individually small. Dad made them impossible to ignore. Yeah. He made the cost visible. Made it impossible to pretend it wasn't happening. And yeah, innocent people paid for that. People who had nothing to do with what Karen did. Zuri was quiet for a long moment. You think they were already paying? I think they were paying for a system that valued their convenience over other people's dignity, Imani said. They just didn't know it, because the cost wasn't being charged to them directly. She thought about something one of their foundation clients had said, a black doctor who'd been questioned about his first-class ticket despite wearing his hospital ID badge. He'd told them, I've been absorbing these costs my whole life. Every time I dressed better than I needed to for a flight, so I wouldn't be questioned. Every time I carried extra documentation to prove I belonged somewhere. Every time I smiled and stayed calm while being treated like a criminal. Those costs add up. They're just invisible. So we make sure it meant something, Zuri said, echoing words they'd spoken 2 years ago. That's still the answer. That's still the answer, Imani confirmed. We can't undo what Dad did. We can't give those people back their wedding day, or their business deal, or their time with family. But we can make sure the system that created the situation in the first place gets torn down and rebuilt. Zuri nodded slowly. We've helped 37 people in 2 years. 37 people who would have had nowhere else to go. It feels small sometimes. It's not small to them. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside their window, Cambridge was quiet. Most students were asleep. You think we'll ever stop questioning it? Zuri asked. No, Imani said honestly. I think we'll question it for the rest of our lives. Whether the cost was too high, whether innocent people should have paid, whether there was a better way. Good, Zuri said. Imani looked at her sister surprised. Good. The day we stop questioning it is the day we become like Karen. So sure of our righteousness that we stop seeing the people affected by our choices. Imani considered that, then nodded slowly. Yeah, you're right. They stayed up another hour talking about their classes, their friends, normal 19-year-old concerns. But the weight of what they carried, the foundation, the responsibility, the knowledge of their power and its consequences never fully lifted. It was the price of justice, and they'd chosen to pay it. Desmond Williams stood alone in his office late on a Friday evening, the Manhattan skyline glittering below him like scattered diamonds. On his desk sat 2 photographs. The first, Imani and Zuri at their high school graduation caps and gowns, bright smiles, the whole future ahead of them. The second, taken last month at a Williams Foundation gala. His daughters, older now, standing between Rosa Martinez and her granddaughter, all four of them smiling. He'd been told his whole life that a black man with power was dangerous, that black anger was a threat, that he should build his empire quietly, move through boardrooms like a ghost, never give anyone reason to fear him. And he'd done exactly that for decades. Built in silence, negotiated in whispers, made himself indispensable without ever making himself visible. The irony wasn't lost on him. The moment he'd finally used his power visibly, the moment he'd let his anger show, was to protect his daughters from the very system that had taught him to be quiet. "Would I do it again?" he asked the empty office. The answer came immediately. "Yes, but with a caveat, I'd do it better." That's what he'd been trying to do for 2 years, use his power with more precision, build preventative systems instead of just punitive responses, work with his daughters to create infrastructure that protected everyone, not just the people with powerful fathers. He thought about Lawrence Hampton's televised apology, about the 25 planes he'd stripped from Orifly's fleet and given to United, about the $75 million funding the foundation that was changing the industry piece by piece. He thought about Karen Whitmore, whose life had been destroyed, about David Price, quietly broken and forgotten. He felt no satisfaction in their ruin, just a grim acknowledgement that consequences, when they finally came, rarely distinguished between the people who deserved them and the people caught in the blast radius. But he also thought about the 37 people the foundation had helped, the policies that had changed, the training programs that had been implemented, the Flight Truth app with its 2 million users reporting and documenting discrimination in real time. The sledgehammer had been necessary to break through decades of institutional indifference. But his daughters had taught him something crucial. After you break something, you have to build something better in its place. That's what they were doing now. Building. And maybe that was the real measure of power, not just what you could destroy, but what you could create from the rubble. 2 years after JFK, Karen Whitmore stood behind the counter of a different Quick Mart in a different city, Flagstaff, Arizona this time. She'd moved again 3 months ago after someone in Albuquerque had recognized her, despite the changed hair and the new name. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, the overnight shift. The store was empty except for her and the fluorescent hum of refrigerator units. A woman came in, Latina, maybe 35, holding a sleeping toddler against her shoulder. She looked exhausted in that specific way that parents of small children look. Hair in a messy ponytail, yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, dark circles under her eyes. "Is your phone working?" the woman asked, her accent marking her as a native Spanish speaker. "Mine died and my car broke down about 2 miles back. I need to call a tow truck." 2 years ago, Karen's instinct would have been suspicion. Store policy, insurance liability. What if she's trying to rob the place? What if this is a setup? But that voice, that poisonous, fearful voice that had governed her decisions for 14 years, didn't have the same power anymore. Maybe because she'd lost everything it had promised to protect. Maybe because she'd spent 2 years seeing clearly what that voice had cost her. "Yeah, of course," Karen said, reaching for the store phone behind the counter. She unplugged it and handed it across. "Take your time." The woman's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Thank you so much. My daughter. She has to go to daycare early tomorrow, and if I can't get the car fixed..." Her voice broke. "It's okay," Karen said quietly. "Make the call." While the woman talked to the tow service, Karen went to the cooler and grabbed a bottle of water. She paid for it out of her own pocket, $1.79 that she couldn't really afford, and set it on the counter. When the woman hung up, Karen slid the water toward her. "On the house. Tow truck takes a while sometimes." The woman stared at the bottle, then at Karen, and fresh tears spilled over. "You don't know what this means. I was so scared I'd be stuck out there all night." After she left tow truck arrived 20 minutes later, Karen stood in the empty store staring at the space where the woman had been. She hadn't thought about the woman's race, hadn't calculated risk, hadn't protected some imaginary kingdom. She'd just seen a person who needed help. It wasn't redemption. The video of her at JFK still existed. Her name was still poisoned. Her old life was still gone and wasn't coming back. But she'd made a choice tonight that was different from the choices she'd made for 14 years. And maybe that was all that was left. Not redemption. Not forgiveness. Just the quiet, invisible work of being different going forward, even if no one ever knew. Even if it changed nothing about her ruined life. Maybe that was its own kind of karma. The hardest kind. Imani and Zuri stood in Terminal 4 at JFK 2 years, almost to the day after the incident. They were flying to Washington, D.C. for a Williams Foundation Gala first-class tickets on Delta. They'd deliberately chosen to fly through the same terminal. Not for drama. Not to prove a point. But because avoiding it would have given it power it didn't deserve. As they walked through the departures area, they passed the Oriflay counter. The airline was still operating smaller, now humbled but alive. The Celeste class lane was still there, though the carpet looked worn. A different agent stood at the counter. Young professional processing a black family of 4 with warmth and efficiency. No extra questions, no suspicion, just service. Zuri paused, watching the interaction. "Should we feel something?" she asked her sister. Imani looked around at the terminal. The same floor, the same lights, the same flow of humanity rushing toward destinations. "I feel tired." Good tired or bad tired? Both. They continued walking through security, no issues to their gate. First class, different airline. The gate agent smiled at them. "Welcome aboard. You're in 2A and 2B today. No questions, no flags, no proof required." As the plane took off, Zuri looked out the window at JFK shrinking below them. At Terminal 4, where it had all started. "You think it mattered?" she asked. All of it. Imani pulled out her phone and showed her sister an email they'd received that morning. From a young man, recent college graduate flying first class to a job interview. Gate agent had questioned his ticket. He'd calmly mentioned the Williams Foundation and asked if she was familiar with their work on discrimination cases. The agent had immediately apologized and processed him through. "Just wanted to say thank you," the email read. "Your story gave me the words to stand up for myself." Zuri read it, tears welling in her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "It mattered. Let me tell you what I've learned from stories like this one. Power isn't good or evil. It's a tool. And like any tool, its morality depends entirely on how it's used and who pays the price. Desmond Williams had the power to ground an airline. He used it. 81 aircraft, thousands of disrupted passengers, millions in losses. Was he right? That's not for me to answer. But I'll tell you what he was protecting. He was protecting his daughters from learning the lesson he'd spent his entire life unlearning, that there are places they don't belong, that their presence requires justification, that no matter what they achieve, someone will always have the power to make them prove they deserve to be there. Karen Whitmore had power too. Smaller power, yes. But in that moment at that counter, her power was absolute. She decided who belonged and who didn't, who deserved dignity and who deserved suspicion. She wielded that power for 14 years. 17 formal complaints. How many informal ones? How many people walked away from her counter feeling exactly what Imani and Zuri felt, but didn't have a father who could shut down an airline? That's the question that stays with me. Desmond's response was extreme, maybe even disproportionate, but it was visible. We saw it. We judged it. We debated it. The consequences were immediate and impossible to ignore. But Karen's cruelty, that was invisible, accepted, protected by a culture that valued efficiency over humanity. Until it wasn't. The karma that found her wasn't just about one bad day, it was about 14 years of small cruelties that the system protected. 14 years of passengers who absorbed the cost quietly because they didn't have someone who could make it visible. 2 years later, Karen stocks shelves at a convenience store in Arizona. Is that justice? I don't know. But she no longer has the power to harm anyone from behind a counter. Sometimes that's enough. The twins run a foundation that's helped 37 people fight back against discrimination. They've changed industry policies. They've made the invisible visible. They've turned their humiliation into infrastructure for change. Is that enough to balance the scales to justify the thousands who missed flights that day? I don't know. What I do know is this change is expensive. Someone always pays. The question isn't whether there will be cost. The question is who bears it and whether the cost produces something better. For 14 years, individual passengers bore the cost of Karen's prejudice. Quietly, invisibly, easy to ignore. For 36 hours, thousands of passengers bore the cost of holding her accountable. Loudly, visibly, impossible to ignore. Both costs are real, but only one produced change. If you've witnessed bias at a counter, on a flight, in a boardroom, anywhere, your presence was questioned, your story belongs here. Share it below. Because when we speak up, we don't just fight individual battles, we build systems that rise above the old ones. And sometimes that's the only way forward.